So, Nick, we got a lot to talk about and unpack on today's episode. Some Belal Muhammad stuff. You know, there's a lot of talk about who his next opponent's going to be. Looking like it probably will be the end of year this year before we see him back in there again.
Right.
And there's talks, the two names on the tip of everybody's tongue, Kamaru Usman and Shavkat Rakhmonov. So we'll sort of unpack that and break down both options and discuss what would be best for Belal in his first title defense, because it's certainly not going to be Leon Edwards. We're going to talk some Dan Hooker. You know, he's looking to insert himself in the Conor McGregor sweepstakes, and he said he wants to be the ultimate, quote, black belt level troll and steal the fight that Michael Chandler's been sitting out 2 years waiting patiently for.
You gotta love
from Chandler. So interesting stuff there. We'll talk that. A little bit of Francis Ngannou. You know, he's coming back after a little layoff from MMA to go do 2 boxing fights. He's going to be fighting for the PFL belt against Renan Fajeda, a 6'8" giant who's just on a knockout tear. And then also Sean O'Malley's a little bit unhappy with the UFC and some stuff. So we'll break into what's got Sean a little bit disgruntled. But I really want to start, you know, with the fights that happened this past weekend. We thought the co-main event, Tabitha Ricci versus Angela Hill, had stolen the show until the main event came around.
Right.
And Caio Borralho really cemented himself as a top prospect and top talent at 185, beating and almost finishing the always tough Jared Cannonier.
Right.
And this fight was back and forth because Jared certainly had his rounds. I want to start there and get your technical analysis on, you know, what Caio did right in order to get past a really tough veteran like Cannonier. Do you see him as a top 5 prospect now that he's knocked off the number 5 fighter in Cannonier? And what are some good matchups for him? You know, I was reading today, a lot of people are suggesting that Adesanya would be a great matchup for him. They usually don't pair people coming off a win with people coming off of a couple of losses, but with a massive name like Adesanya and a very dynamic striking style, I don't hate that idea. So thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I love that. And I'll just say I'm 0-2 on the past 2 weekends of middleweight title fights. We had the pay-per-view that I obviously got wrong.
And coincidentally, I'm 2-0.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if you're going to bet, go with this guy, not with me, especially in the middleweight division. But, yeah, I thought Caio Borralho looked really good. He, you know, every time somebody steps into a 5-round environment, and we've not seen them in the UFC take on that kind of challenge, you start to wonder. And we say it all the time. When you've got a guy who's been to the top of the division, who's been in a title fight, who's fought the who's who of the division, they usually have a little bit more experience and a few more tricks up their sleeve that they can show the young up-and-comer. To me, it looked like Jared Cannonier fought a very good fight. I had it 2-2 going into the 5th round. I could see the case for 3-1, but for me personally, I had it 2-2. And Borralho looked like, just for every trick that Cannonier was trying to utilize on him, he had something to counter and something to show back to Cannonier. It showed a lot of great potential, a lot of discipline in sticking to his game plan. And I think he just went out there with the right game plan. Obviously, he was the younger fighter. He's big. He's very big for 185.
And you have to remember, Jared was originally a heavyweight. So when you see how big Caio Borralho is, just remember that the guy he was standing across from is a former heavyweight.
Right, yeah. So he's a massive guy, got the reach advantage. And when you have those types of advantages, you have to use them. You don't want to go out there and let the older man be faster than you, or you don't want to have the guy who's a little bit shorter than you control the range. And I think Caio did a very good job at controlling the range. There was a lot of stance switching taking place between both fighters. Originally, it was initiated by Caio kicking the legs really successfully of Cannonier, causing some stance switching. And then we saw a little bit of offensive stance switching out of Borralho, where he would, you know, throw his nice combination, end it with a high kick or end it with some sort of kick. And then instead of stepping back into his original stance, he would just switch there, and then he'd hang out in a temporary stance switch, which I thought was very good. It kept Jared Cannonier frozen even after the attacks were coming. And I thought that's one of those things that it takes an experienced high-level fighter to understand where you're safe and where you're not when you're switching stances. I don't care if you're the highest level fighter the world's ever seen or if you're a new guy, you will not feel as comfortable in the opposite stance as you do in your traditional stance. But as far as Borralho goes, I didn't really see a whole lot of difference in skill when he was in southpaw versus when he was in orthodox. So props to Borralho. I think he is absolutely leading the charge after last night in the new wave of middleweights that we'll see hanging around for the next 5 to 7 years and being a problem at the top of the division. Everybody likes to throw Bo Nickal's name in there, Hamzat's name in there, and for good reason. They belong there. But I think after last night, people are going to realize that Borralho belongs in that exact same conversation. And with the rankings, now he's in the top 5. He just stole the number 5 slot. So he's going to be paired up with somebody who's probably very experienced, if not really anybody at the top of 185 that hasn't either been in a title shot, been a champion, or been somebody who's a staple in division for a long time. So I think Borralho's got a very tough road ahead of him. But after what we saw last night, the discipline, like I was saying, the controlling of the cage, the damage when he was able to get his shots off, especially that final sequence, I personally think it could have been ended after that drop to the ground.
He should have walked off.
Yeah.
That would have probably caused the stoppage.
Yeah, and it's weird because you never your coaches will go crazy if you do that. Remember Jalen Rose, Hanato Moicano?
Yeah.
He thought he dropped and did a walk-off.
Jalen Turner.
Jalen Turner, yeah.
Jalen Rose, I think, is the basketball guy. I don't think
I think he's a commentary guy. Yeah, I got too much commentary on my mind. But Jalen Turner, yeah, he walked off and then it ended up biting him in the ass and he lost that fight. So it was good for Borralho to not do that, not take that risk. But at the same time, I was with you. If he would have walked off, judging by what I saw out of Jared Cannonier's eyes and body language, he probably wouldn't have been able to get up and they would have called it there. But all in all, nothing to scoff at. Borralho's here. He's arrived. Now he's in the top 5. I think he's got the look that the UFC's looking for. Obviously, the record. And now when he's bringing big names like Jared Cannonier onto his resume, especially getting a win over those guys, the sky's the limit. And with a lot of moving parts happening at the top of 185, you don't know who's going to be there tomorrow, who's going to jump to 185, who's going to take a big loss like Israel just did. And with all this stuff moving, I think Borralho has a real shot at being a number 1 contender or potentially find himself in a title fight at some point next year.
Yeah, for sure. And I have to give a shout out to our good friend Jay Miller at Crossover MMA.
Let's go, Jay.
So he said a while back that, I think it's a couple months ago, 185 is going to be the most exciting division over the next 12 to 18 months.
That's right.
And it's certainly seeming like that's going to be the case. You know, we're seeing a lot of movement.
Oh, yeah.
We're seeing the king of 185 since Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya now on a 2-fight losing streak and likely shuffling his way down the deck and potentially running into people like Caio Borralho or another fighter making their way up, a Hamza Chimaev or something like that.
Right.
But to me, at 185, there's 2 guys that are the litmus test, right? You have a fighter who's a promising prospect. You put him against one of these 2 guys, and most of the time the hype train is derailed.
Right.
Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier.
That's right.
Those are your 2 staples in the division. Now, Jared's 40. His chance at competing for titles is more than likely over. Robert Whittaker is like a Max Holloway, where he's been around so long, but he's still so young that he's in that unique spot that he's like a young veteran.
Yeah.
But to me, you throw somebody against one of those 2 guys, and it's sink or swim, and you'll tell real quick whether or not they're ready for the big leagues. Right. And Caio Borralho showed that he is absolutely ready for the big leagues. I love that you mentioned the size, because I don't think you can overstate that. I mean, Caio Borralho is a big man.
Huge.
Jared Cannonier, the former heavyweight. Now, I get he was not a Francis Ngannou heavyweight where he's built out muscular as far as like the body composition goes.
Right.
He was a little bit pudgier of a heavyweight, but still big nonetheless, and he's worked his way down, but by no means is Jared Cannonier a small middleweight.
No.
He's a very big guy, and so Caio being in there towering over him, I was like, wow, this guy's a sizable character, and he's going to be a problem, especially if he can start to land that power.
Right.
And even though Caio didn't get the finish, I feel like he fights with a real finishing style.
Yeah.
You know, he does get most of his fights done by way of finish, by way of knockout. Right. And so that's what the UFC wants to see if they're considering fast-tracking somebody. Now, with a win like what he had over Jared Cannonier, it wasn't without adversity. I did have it 2-2 going into the 5th as well. You know, Caio had that busted-up eye. He had eaten some big shots from Jared Cannonier, showed durability, showed chin, showed heart, and showed a lot of skill, especially in the stance switch, as you mentioned. I think he is top 5 material. I think he's a guy that we got to put him now 1, possibly 2 fights away from competing for a title. And the only reason I say 2 is because you're likely going to have Sean Strickland in there with DDP next. You know, who knows which way that goes, but if Sean gets it, then you could see the rubber match happen. Hamzat's in there with Bobby Knuckles. If Bobby gets past Hamzat, hard to deny him a title shot.
Right.
If Hamzat gets past Bobby, even though you could make the argument that Khamzat really hasn't done enough heavy lifting at 185 to get the title shot, he is a big enough name to probably grab it. So I think Caio Borralho is probably going to be 1 or 2 fights away. So I love the Adesanya idea. I think that fight is a great fight. I think it's a winnable fight for Caio, but I also think it's a very winnable fight for Izzy too. And I'd love to see it. It'd be fun. It would be a striker's delight. I don't think that fight would be dull. I don't think it would end up going to the ground that often. And that's what you do if you're a fighter like Caio Borralho. You look at the landscape and you're like, okay, I'm not going to get the title shot next.
Right.
Sean Strickland is probably going to get it. Now you got Pereira talking about coming back down. As I mentioned, Khamzat and Robert. Okay, title shots off the table for the time being. Right. But I just beat a top 5 guy. Now I'm in the top 5. Who can I set my cannons towards? Who is going to propel me into that title fight? Well, who's the biggest name in the division, even coming off 2 losses, still by a country mile? It's Israel Adesanya.
For sure.
When you talk about the body of work, there's no fighter at middleweight, whether they're on a fight skid like Adesanya or on a winning streak like Caio Borralho, that has the resume that Adesanya has and has that name recognition. So I say he should probably point his cannons in that direction. If I was advising him, that's who I would tell him to go for.
Yeah.
If he can't get that, maybe see what shakes out with Rob and Khamzat. That's kind of coming up in a couple of months. Maybe some things happen there that kind of move things along in the division. But very impressive performance by Caio Borralho. I think he's going to be around for a long time. And these fighting nerds out of Brazil are good, man. I think I saw a statistic online today. I think there's 3 fighters in particular that are fighting, and I'm drawing a blank on the gentleman that just beat Li Jinliang.
Oh, yeah, Prates.
Yeah, Prates. Sorry, Carlos Prates. Like him, Caio Borralho, and there's a couple others, and they're like all on an undefeated streak right now.
Beasts.
MMA nerds are representing in full effect. Yeah. So lots of exciting things to come there.
Yeah, and I want to say real quick, because I don't want to call it a blunder, but Borralho did call out DDP.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to him mentioning DDP. Obviously, he was 11 last night. Now, coming into next week, he will be number 5. So it makes sense for a number 5 guy to call out the champion. But like you said, there's a log jam. There's people that on merit alone have earned the title shot before him. And so he'll have to wait a little while. I would have loved to hear him call Israel out and then say, and don't worry, DDP, I'm still coming for you. You've turned down fights with me. I don't know what he said exactly, but something to that effect. You didn't want to fight me earlier in our careers, and now that you got the belt, you better be ready, because I'm coming. I think that was a great call. I think it's good for him to start laying the groundwork for his future work in the UFC. But everybody knows he's not getting DDP next. He's going to have to go through somebody. And when you're looking at the top 5 of the middleweight division, Izzy, far and away, like you said, is the biggest name. He's going to be available. They don't have him obviously matched up with anybody right now. And everybody else is pretty much taken with a dance partner. So at this point, Borralho, if he wants to crack into fighting somebody that's ranked closer to the champion than him, he's going to have to really pick and choose. It's got to be Israel, or he's just got to have to wait around a little bit and see who loses one of these major contender fights. But all in all, man, Borralho, his stock went way up last night. I think he made himself a very likable character, and I don't think he was ever unlikable. I just think people might have been looking over him. And now
he was one of those guys that you were like, he's good. He's got a lot of promise. He's on a win streak. Throw him in there, maybe a co-main event on a fight night or something. But no, he got the main event slot. And he showed out. So now it's like, okay, we knew who he was. We knew he had skill. We know he's very exciting. He's very brash. He's fun to watch. But last night he cemented himself as a real top guy at 85.
Yeah, because if you can beat Cannonier and do it that way, dropped him a couple of times. One of them was very devastating. It shows you've got power. And I really did like the fact that he got that most significant knockdown of the fight, the most significant moment of the fight in the 5th round towards the end of it. So it shows he wasn't gassing out. That was a little bit of my concern originally. Is like, we haven't seen him in 5 rounds in the UFC. I don't know how his energy is going to be, because he's such a high level explosive fighter. He loves to push down on the gas and really try to leave somebody behind, put them in the dust, and then they can't catch up. Borralho showed a lot of discipline. He showed a lot of maturity in his game, and I think the sky's the limit for him. I really want to see what he does next. I'm not leaning towards Izzy happening next for him, just because I don't know when Izzy's going to come back, and I think Borralho needs to strike while the iron's hot. He needs to get back in there before the year ends. I think he will do that. Probably going to have to fight somebody 6 through 10, but either way, the sky's the limit for him.
Yeah, let's move down a division.
Let's
Belal
go.
Muhammad. So, you know, who his next opponent's going to be, I think we all kind of knew after the Leon Edwards fight, because he did kind of dominate Leon,
Yeah.
that it wasn't going to be Leon. You know, Leon's not that champion that's was uber exciting that everybody wants to see immediately get a rematch, you know, and I like, this is coming from somebody who likes Leon. So
love him.
this is not a diss to him, but he wasn't one of the top 5 most popular champions in the UFC. He certainly wasn't at the top of the list when it comes to activity and defending his belt. So I think the UFC is going to make Leon Edwards fight at least one more fight before putting him back into a title shot. Now, had the first fight been a victory for Leon and it was a 1-1, that would be a different story, but it ended in that eye poke and the weird no contest, and then Belal came back and kind of dominated him. So really, we're sitting with 2 names, and these 2 names keep coming up to me over and over again on social media and various articles in the MMA sphere and stuff, and it's Kamaru Usman and Shavkat Rakhmonov.
Right.
Now, for me, Shavkat Rakhmonov is the clear-cut guy.
Yeah, clear
He's
as day.
Undefeated, 100% finish rate. I really do believe there's something to be said for top prospects getting their shot to crack into the title and fight for belts and stuff like that.
Right.
And not just putting people in there because of name recognition alone.
Right.
You're seeing that with Merab Dvalishvili. He's the rightful person that's going to be fighting Sugar Sean. We'll talk a little bit more about that fight later on in this episode and some of the things that Sean is disgruntled with. And I love Kamaru Usman too. But Kamaru Usman's on a 3-fight losing streak.
Right.
You know, are we really going to start giving guys title shots that are on a 3-fight skid just because they were once a great champion? I don't think that's the right precedent to set. Now, if they make the fight Usman versus Muhammad, sign me up. I'm
Right.
going to watch it. It's going to be a great fight.
Right.
And Kamaru Usman actually could win that fight. I think my early money would be on Belal, but certainly Kamaru wouldn't be out of that fight. But I believe there's something to be said for merit, performance. And look, Dana White said himself, when you come out and you fight in the UFC, fight to win, fight to finish, make your fights exciting.
Yes.
And now's the time that, like, you have a fighter who has done nothing but that. He's 100% followed your game plan. Never has somebody stepped into the cage with him and made it to the end of 3 rounds or made it to the end of 5 rounds.
18 pro fights, 18 wins, 18
finishes. So, you know, I think the UFC needs to make good on their word. Hey, we're going to fast track guys that have exciting finishing styles. And so what? He doesn't speak English. The guy's stoic. He doesn't. So, like, Alex Pereira doesn't speak English either. He's one of the most popular, if not the most popular fighter in the sport right now. Stars can be built off of performances these days, and that's what you're seeing with AP. And now I think we can see that with Shavkat. Him versus Belal would be insanity.
Oh, yeah. I think that fight is the one to make. For me, the Kamaru Usman one just sort of feels like a lob shot. Kamaru doesn't belong in the title shot. And I believe when all the memes that me and you are seeing on Instagram and social media about Kamaru and Shavkat kind of being the 2 guys, everybody is probably a little surprised when they see Kamaru's name there. It's like, okay, we know him, he's a former champ, all that stuff, but he hasn't been winning. So when I saw that, I was surprised. I was like, I feel like Shavkat's clearly above Kamaru Usman as far as merit goes. But I bet you Kamaru was equally as surprised when he started to realize, hey, I might have another title shot in me, and I might not have to do any winning to get it. So for Kamaru, I love Kamaru. I would love to see him get more title fights, but in some ways, I'm a little bit of a purist. And unless you have some sort of crazy star power like a Conor McGregor or an Israel Adesanya, I find it really hard to make a case to insert you back into a title fight off of losses, especially 3 in a row. So when you've got a guy like Shavkat who literally has a perfect record, it's even all the way through, and he seems like the bully of that division. That's a little play on Belal's fight name. But when you have a guy like Shavkat and he's a monster, and you bring up the point he doesn't speak English, I get that, but I was lucky enough to be in the room and in UFC in the spectrum of the UFC last year, and he was fighting on the card. And he's a monster. He's scared, or not scared. He's scary to a lot of people. Everybody sees him as this monster, this up and coming force that's kind of unstoppable. And while yes, it's always good to have somebody speak English, the WWE always used to talk about this, and I've heard it. Chael Sonnen say it, and other people. Brock Lesnar never spoke. Of course, he knows how to speak English, and when he would grab the mic at the UFC, he would cut promos better than almost anybody.
Yeah,
but Vince McMahon's whole mantra with Brock Lesnar is monsters don't speak. They don't have to speak. They're just their presence enough.
Think of Bane from Batman. He says very little.
Yeah, 5 or 10 words per 30 minutes, and that's all you get out of that guy. But I think Shavkat's that sort of way. Of course, he can speak to his people in his language, and he'll learn a little bit of English here and there, but he's a monster. He doesn't really need to talk that much. I think he does most of his work in the octagon with his hands and his feet. So I think that's clearly the option I would go with. Now, one other thing I'll throw at you that might put a wrench into those plans, because I think Kamaru still does have a shot at getting this title shot, is, as far as I know, Ali Abdelaziz manages Kamaru Usman, and he also manages Belal Muhammad.
Yeah.
And there's very few managers in the game that actually know what they're doing. They're the smartest guy in the room when they're in a meeting.
And can pull weight.
And can pull serious weight. Now, we've seen Ali get his fighters title shots against other fighters of his. And that's very impressive, very remarkable. But I think if Belal and Ali say, hey, let's do Kamaru as the first one, and Kamaru signs on it, of course he will, they'll have it won't be like a non-friendly thing. I think they'll have a friendly respect for each other, and they'll go out and see who the better man is. But that's the only way I would see them not giving it to Shavkat first and them going with Kamaru Usman. If the champion wants it, if the manager of both of the fighters want it, I could see that being the move. Also, Kamaru Usman, he's not the biggest star in the world, but he is a name a lot of people know, and his days of title shots are closing very quickly. I thought they were closed already, but they're closing quickly even if he does get another one. And I think that if they can get a name like that on Belal's resume, it'll set him up for more stardom and bigger opportunities when he does have to fight the Shavkats, the
Jack Della Maddalena.
When he can go against those guys, if he can have a couple of title fights under his belt, I think that will bode well in his favor. So all in all, you can't go wrong with either fight. But if you're asking me personally, as far as what I'd like to see and who I think deserves it, Shavkat all day long.
No, that's a really good point about Ali. I hadn't really considered that, but he does tend to have his pull and have his way in certain scenarios. And so
think of Justin and Khabib.
Yeah, no, it's actually a great point. So something to consider there. And when you're looking at the landscape and the merit, Shavkat gets it all day long, but he has that one that one X factor, ace in the hole, as it were. I want to talk a little Francis Ngannou now, because he's coming back against Renan Ferreira.
Long-awaited debut, huh?
Yes, long-awaited PFL debut. The PFL, when they backed the Brinks truck up for Francis, we're hoping that this day would come. And not a lot of us really thought with 100% of surety that it would come, because we knew Francis was going to go and make a boatload of money in boxing, and whether or not he would want to come back and fight whoever was at the top of the heap in the PFL, who's likely not a household name. Renan Ferreira, no disrespect to him, is not a guy that the casual fans even know about.
Most people don't even know what the PFL is.
Right,
exactly.
They
can be UFC fans that watch every weekend. They don't know what the PFL is.
Exactly. And but this fight to me is a really interesting fight. It's a very challenging fight for Francis. Renan Ferreira made Francis look small at the press conference, which that's not an easy thing to do. There's very few people on planet Earth that can make Francis Ngannou look small.
Seriously.
But Ferreira is one of the guys that can do that. This guy's on a knockout tear. Made 21-second quick work of Ryan Bader. Now, I know Ryan Bader's a light heavyweight, and
long in the tooth,
we can get into all that, but this guy is pretty much knocking out everybody that's coming in front of him. So why is this fight interesting to me? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, Francis has been gone out of the MMA scene for quite some time.
Yeah.
However, Francis's best wins in MMA came with his hands.
Right.
So what's he been doing for the last 2 years? Improving his hands by way of boxing fights. So I expect Francis to come back a better striker than he ever was. He's not the guy that gets finished, that gets knocked out. He's lost a couple of times, but you had that dud with Derek Lewis, the Stipe Miocic fight, the first one. So Francis is not a guy who's going to go in there and get starched, but he is the guy who starches people. So, and neither is Ferreira. He's not the guy to get knocked out, but he knocks out everybody. Right. So you have these two unmovable forces, that are going to be colliding with each other. Here's the other thing, though, and I mentioned knockout, and I caveat that by saying MMA specifically. Francis got brutally finished by Anthony Joshua.
Right.
I know it's a different sport. I know it's a different thing. But when you walk around planet Earth with the confidence that Francis had when he left the UFC, nobody sits me down, nobody, knocks me out. I knock everybody out. I'm the predator. I'm the scariest guy on the planet. and then you get starched by a guy like Anthony Joshua, who honestly made it look easy.
Yeah.
Do you come back with the same confidence? Because yes, Renan Ferreira is not 1/10 the boxer AJ is,
Right.
but I bet you he can punch damn near as hard.
Yeah.
And so Francis in his mind is thinking, okay, like this guy, I've been knocked out now. It's not, I'm not this, godlike, unmovable force. Like I can be finished, I can be knocked out. Does that play with him psychologically? And then the third reason that I'm really interested to see this is, unfortunately for Francis, he lost his son.
Yeah.
And so he's fighting for Kobe, his son, his late son. And he said that this fight is dedicated to him. So I'm expecting to see Francis come out with the biggest chip on his shoulder that we've ever seen. And it'll be interesting to see if Renan Ferreira can really withstand the storm that is coming his way. But I want to break down the fight, want to talk about the fight. But if Francis wins, the conversation immediately is going to get inserted again. The three horsemen, Tom Aspinall, Francis Ngannou,
Right.
John Jones. And the likelihood of those three people never fighting each other is probably more likely than not. And that's quite a sad proposition. But thoughts on the fight, and do you think those John Jones / Tom Aspinall conversations will resurface with a Francis win?
Well, you lay it all out very well. And I think Ferreira is a very skilled fighter that nobody really knows about yet. So that's always the most dangerous guy because he's got nothing to lose. Francis Ngannou should go out there and he was the heavyweight world champion. He went out there and in everybody's eyes beat Tyson Fury, the #1 boxer in the world.
3-1 favorite in this fight.
Right. So everything was pointing in that direction. And I will say this real quickly. Once he fought Tyson Fury, I thought there wasn't a chance in hell we'd ever see Francis Ngannou do MMA again. Not just, I think the PFL was like, oh, damn, we lost him. We had this great fighter, the heavyweight world champion, the scariest guy in the world.
At least we got Jake Paul.
Yeah. That's why they signed Jake Paul afterwards. So I think that Francis Ngannou fighting Renan Ferreira is going to be an interesting thing because if Francis comes out emotional, which he's not, he's got ice running through his veins. He can go over to the Middle East and put on a performance like he did against Tyson Fury and look so good. Obviously, the AJ fight didn't go well. AJ did his homework, figured out where the holes were in Francis' game.
Took him seriously.
And completely exploited him. And that's why it feels like a fresh coat of paint for Francis to come back to MMA. Because as soon as he lost to AJ, I go, oh, his next fight 100% will be in MMA. And I'm sure the PFL noticed that and realized that early. But you've got this 6'8" guy that not a lot of people know about. I'm sure he's a freak in his gym. He's the monster of all monsters. There's probably not that many people in all of Brazil that are tougher than him, if any.
If any. How do you get people to even spar with him? I mean, if you think about who he's sparring, they have to fly people in, I'm sure.
Right. We've got heavyweights in our gym, and the sparring partners that they bring in are few and far between, and they come from various parts of the world just to give you the looks you need. So I think this guy's probably similar to that. And this is one of those moments where PFL, yes, they might not be where the UFC is as far as an organization, a company, but they've got a really big name in Francis Ngannou. And a guy like Renan Ferreira, who now can build his name off of Francis Ngannou, you're going to be dealing with a very dangerous fighter. The heavyweight division in boxing throughout history, all the way to MMA, has always been the most sacred division. It's because no mistakes can be made. If you make a mistake, anybody in the heavyweight division can knock you out. And I think that's what makes heavyweight fights so intriguing. And just because on paper Francis should go out and beat this guy doesn't mean that's going to happen. This dude's 6'8", like you said, he towers over Francis. He's built like a bodybuilder. He's just a freak of nature.
Yeah. Also, very good jiu-jitsu, very good grappler as well.
Yeah, I don't imagine we'll see too much groundwork from him, but I think it's going to be a slugfest for the most part. But I think it's going to be a competitive fight. And if Francis is emotional, he doesn't fight the way he usually does, or if he stalls and freezes, kind of like he did in the Derek Lewis fight, we could see him start to get taken over in these in the rounds, and now he's fighting from behind. That's an issue. I don't really see Francis coming in emotional. I don't really see, even though he lost his son, and that's probably the most tragic thing a human could possibly ever deal with, I don't think that's going to weigh on him while he's in the fight. I think he'll be able to devise a game plan, implement it, and then stick to it and potentially win. I've got him winning this fight.
Yeah,
but
me too.
There's a lot of variables and a lot of things could change. When you got a guy who's 6'8", who has to cut to the heavyweight limit, who is trying to make a name off you, become the face of the PFL, because that's exactly what would happen if he did. And then potentially, I'm going to throw a weird one out there for you. if Francis Ngannou loses to Renan Ferreira, and Renan Ferreira, I don't know what his fight contract with the PFL is. They're going to obviously want to keep him, and they're going to need to pay him really well. But I could see the UFC trying to poach him, trying to grab him and bring him over, and just as one more little shove to Francis Ngannou, if they could be like, all right, we're going to take the one and only guy that you had some sort of feud going with in the PFL, we're going to take him away. Now you've got no more roster to deal with. I could see something like that happening, but of course he's got to get through Francis and do it in spectacular fashion for that to be even on the table.
Yeah, the UFC will 100% go for Ferreira when his contract's up if he knocks out Francis Ngannou. And I say knock out because, I mean, what's the most likely way Renan Ferreira defeats Francis Ngannou?
Yeah,
I mean, probably either way this fight goes, it's going to be a knockout one way or the other. I don't see this going to judges' scorecards after 5 rounds. No. I think either Ferreira or Ngannou is going to find the shot that ends the night.
Right.
So look for Ferreira to come out like a bat out of hell to try to have the night and performance of his life.
Right.
Because, yes, he's in the PFL. I'm sure he's paid well. You know, you have the opportunity to win $1 million every year with the PFL. So there's certainly a lucrative, it's a lucrative proposition for those that are at the top of the heap in the PFL, but not nearly as lucrative as being at the top of heavyweight in the UFC.
No doubt.
Especially not right now.
Yeah.
Especially not while John Jones is there, especially not while Tom Aspinall is there. And don't expect John Jones to stick around for an unknown 6'8" monster who knocked out Francis Ngannou if that were to happen.
No chance that's happening.
Yeah, 0% chance that will happen. But, you know, he's going to be looking to make that statement. You know, I have not looked him up on Instagram to see how many followers he has compared to the top guys, John Jones, Stipe Miocic, Tom Aspinall in the UFC. But I would venture to say that he's got less than 10% of the followers that each one of those guys have.
Right.
Not nearly the name recognition, not nearly the sponsorship revenue and things of that nature. So how do you get that? You go out there and you knock out the guy who didn't lose his belt, who actually left the organization as the reigning champion.
Who over the past couple of years has made millions and millions of dollars. And it's not true across the board, but a lot of times people like to go to that analogy. You can't wake up in silk sheets and then go run your 5 miles. You know, when people start to make the tens and 20s of millions of dollars, they start to weather a little bit in their discipline and their drive. So I don't think that's the case for Francis, but it could be. You know, we aren't with Francis every day. We don't see that. And if you've got a guy that's hungry, who's never been at the top, who's never had a marquee name like Francis Ngannou on his resume, he's going to be looking not only to beat him and make a statement, but to line his pockets as well and secure his future in the PFL.
Yeah, and this will really tell a lot because we'll see based on Francis's performance and the way he comes out, and we see how well conditioned or not conditioned he is. You know, how motivated he was for this fight, because I think he made somewhere between $50 and $75 million to fight Anthony Joshua.
Insane.
You know, and it's absurd amount of money.
Right.
Suffice it to say, he's not making 5% of that in this PFL fight. Right. You know, he's making, you know, nothing compared to what he made to box AJ and Tyson Fury.
Right.
So if he comes out and it's like the old Francis, then we know he's just motivated because he wants to fight again. He really is doing this for his son, and he's going to come out and give it 100% effort, even though it's a massive pay cut to the last 2 paydays that he's experienced. So. Right. I'm really excited about it. I will break this fight down because it is coming up in 2 months at a later date. But my early prediction is that Francis is going to get his hand raised.
Yeah.
I think there still is levels between the PFL and the UFC. And yes, there are people at the top of the PFL that could compete with people at the top of the UFC. But as far as depth goes, man, when you come up the heavyweight division, you knock out guys like Alistair Overeem, you defeat people like Stipe Miocic. I mean, Francis Ngannou's the real deal. He has faced nothing but real deal fighters his entire UFC career. And I think Renan Ferreira is very tough and is going to be one of his toughest opponents in recent memory. But all in all, I think Francis gets it done.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Francis is going to go out there and probably win. And I can't wait to break this fight down because after we do this and we got 2 months to get ready for this fight and prepare, I'm going to watch as much Ferreira footage as I can. I know he's an explosive fighter. I know he's pretty fast, even though he's such a big guy. So those types of variables can make for an interesting fight. Francis is a fast fighter, but he's not the world's fastest. Nobody's like, oh man, you got to look at Francis's speed. You got to look at his power. You got to look at the way he sets his shots up, his selection. Everything that he does is really impressive, but speed isn't one of the highest attributes that he has. He's a fast fighter, but not compared to some of the other guys we've seen. Certainly not compared to a Tom Aspinall. Those types of guys just move a little bit different. All in all, I can't wait for it. But yeah, we got a couple of months to do a little bit more homework on Fajeda, see exactly what we're going to see, and then make a better prediction or a more educated prediction.
Yeah, we'll go deep into that one.
Can't wait.
Another one that is interesting that's being discussed now that was not even on the radar a couple of weeks ago, rather.
Yeah.
Dan Hooker, he's looking to be the ultimate troll. He came out and said that he wants to earn his black belt in trolling, and he wants to do that by stealing the Conor McGregor fight away from Michael Chandler. He said that'd be hysterical. Now I've got a number 5 next to my name at the lightweight division. I'm personally not bullish on Conor ever fighting at lightweight again. I think 170 is going to be where it is.
Yeah.
But Conor's always looking at the landscape and figuring out a way he can finagle himself into a massive fight, preferably a title fight, BMF, something of that nature. Those are the types of things that Conor is always on the hunt for.
Right.
And now Dan Hooker may have something more to offer than Michael Chandler does because of that recent win over Mateusz Gamrot. You know, when you think about Conor and like how he would potentially, quote unquote, make it back to the title, I mean, if you just go through the ranks, it's impossible. Conor's not dedicated enough, and there's not enough time left in the tank for Conor to make it through to, a division again.
Yeah, definitely not climbing up the ranks.
Right. So what do? The guy that just jumped over Mateusz Gamrot and all the killers that are in front of him to the number 5 position that actually would be a fun stylistic matchup that could be favorable for Conor is Dan Hooker. So Conor's a businessman at the end of the day. If Hooker makes more sense than Chandler, I think he'll pine for that fight. And there's maybe 2 or 3 guys in the UFC, Conor, John Jones, Pereira's getting to that status now, that can get what they want. You know, the UFC usually tells you, this is what you're doing. If you're not cool with it, then sit out and we'll call you when we have something else for you.
Right.
And that's what you're doing. But Conor and Pereira, John Jones, they can kind of steer their own careers to some degree. And so if Conor's in Dana's ear saying, look, I want Dan Hooker after that performance because I think if I can go out there and knock out the number 5 guy, maybe even if we do it at 170, which I think it will happen at 170, it still has implications and it still matters in Conor's eyes. Now, us purists, this is like nails on a chalkboard. It's painful to say, a win at 170 after how many years without a win gets you a title shot at 155. But let's all be real here. We're talking about the biggest star the sport's ever seen.
He has some exceptions.
Yeah, he gets to play by his own set of rules. And I think the UFC, if they could in any way make Islam Makhachev versus Conor McGregor, if you run a business, you want to look at what was your best night of business, and then how do you repeat that?
Right.
What was the best night of business in the history of the UFC? Conor versus Khabib.
Right.
Almost 1 million pay-per-view buys more than the next one, which, oh, by the way, was also a Conor fight.
And all 6 or 7 before that, too.
With very few exception, were also Conor fights. So how do you do that? Well, Khabib ain't coming back. No. Khabib's not fighting anymore. That ship has sailed. What's the next best thing? Islam Makhachev, Khabib's pupil, his best friend, his quote-unquote brother, even though they're not blood-related. They look at each other as brothers. Conor has had a lot of feud with Islam back in the day and the entire camp. So, if the UFC in any way could make that fight, and I know I'm grasping at straws here and this is a stretch, but they would try to set up a path to allow that collision course to happen. And I think all of us would have thought a couple of years ago, there's no way that a kickboxer like Alex Pereira in his mid-30s, barely starting MMA, is going to make it through the Shark's tank that is the middleweight division to get to Adesanya. So, and boy, what a difference a couple of years makes.
Right.
So look, you can't just assume that there's no path for Conor and Islam to collide at this point when you have players like Dan Hooker that are open and willing to letting McGregor come in and get that shot because it's red panty night for them at the end of the day.
Yeah, I love that. And there's so much to break down about this Conor McGregor, Dan Hooker business. And look, I'm a Michael Chandler fan. I love Iron Mike. I think he deserves the Conor fight, and waiting around, being patient is a good move. It's like a 10x pay. People are, Conor tweeted that, but then it seemed like there was a little bit of sincerity to that. I think the reason Mike was waiting around for so long is because the pay was going to be something.
Massive,
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, he'd have to fight 5 or 6 times just to match that same sort of pay, and probably have to win all of those. So it made sense for Michael to do that, but Dan Hooker is very hot off the press right now, and it's not like the old Dan Hooker. We've been saying insert fighter's name and then add 2.0 to it for many guys. Remember, Hamzat was the first to be like, I'm Khabib 2.0, and then he kind of walked away from that. But then everybody was like, oh, this is a new version of Max Holloway. We've got a new version of Robert Whittaker. This is Robert Whittaker 2.0. I think Dan Hooker is the one that's the most 2.0 that we've ever seen.
Yeah.
He's got the new hair. He's got the new tattoos. He's always been a little bit of a troll, but now he's really embracing that and sort of taking some things from the other city kickboxing guys and the other Australian and New Zealand fighters and utilizing their promotional tactics and their skills outside of the octagon to draw some attention to his name. And of course, we always say this in the sport, MMA is all about what have you done for me lately. Unfortunately for Michael Chandler, the iron is as cold as it's ever been because he hasn't fought in over 2 years. Dan Hooker, just 3 weeks ago, seemed like somebody who was just going to be a gatekeeper. They're going to feed him to the next generation of fighters. Well, he comes out there, he takes on a Mateusz Gamrot, who everybody thought Gamrot was going to go out there and win that fight.
Oh, yeah.
And he goes and shocks the world, puts on an amazing performance, a BMF-style performance, something that will get the attention of Conor McGregor. Conor is a fight fan, don't forget.
Yeah.
He loves the UFC and he loves watching good fights, and he always pays close attention to people within his weight classes that he can style up with and pair up with stylistically that would make sense. Possibly a favorable matchup, somebody that's going to promote the fight with him. And Dan Hooker, after this a couple weekends ago, really showed that he's now a front runner because that number 5 next to his name, the fact that he's a striker, he's going to go out there and he's not going to try to take Conor down. He's going to do the same thing that Gaethje would do, and I believe what Chandler was going to do, go out there and strike with the striker, give the people exactly what they want for the Conor McGregor fight, because we know we're not going to get any more than 5 McGregor fights. I'm leaning more towards about 3 McGregor fights left.
I was about to say like 2 or 3 if we're lucky.
Right. So we got to give the fans what they want to see, and it's really cool that all his opponents understand that as well. But you're a fool if you think the UFC doesn't still see some sort of path, some light at the end of the tunnel for Conor to get back to 155 for a title shot. And I don't think Conor McGregor's days at 55 are over if there's title implications. Now, like you said, 170. If him and Hooker go up there and they fight, there will still be some implications at 55 just because of the star that Conor is and the fact that Hooker is a recently ranked top 5 fighter in the 155 division. But it would be a pretty cool move if they did that fight at 155. Conor McGregor, it would be a tough fight for him, but I think he has a chance to win that fight. And we were talking about it earlier. Kamaru Usman's coming off of 3 losses, and now he's in the discussion over a guy who's got 18 wins in a row, including 18 finishes, to fight Belal Muhammad. So obviously, Kamaru Usman isn't even in the same stratosphere as Conor McGregor as far as star goes. They've got a pretty similar record as far as their last few fights go. If they're willing to make a case for Kamaru Usman to get a title shot, they should probably be willing to make a case for Conor McGregor if he can go out there and beat the number 5 guy in the world. That's far more than what Kamaru has done recently. Kamaru's lost his last 3 fights and all tough opponents, but I think Conor McGregor sees that there's an opportunity there, and it would suck for me to see Michael Chandler get that fight taken away from him. He said he was here for a good time, not a long time, and then, of course, it looks like he's going to be a long time since he's fought because he's just not doing very much activity. I think that the Dan Hooker stealing this fight, though, would be very cool. Conor also is a big troll, and I think everybody's Conor's opponent. Whether you're fighting him or you're just in the division with him and you have to just feud with him somehow. I bet you, just to be funny, he'll get on board with Dan Hooker. They'll throw Michael Chandler to the side. Michael will have to go do some other fighting of his own, and Dan Hooker's ranking is what's really on the line, because I guarantee you if Conor McGregor goes out there and beats Dan Hooker, takes that number 5 ranking, his next fight is for the title against Islam Makhachev, because I don't really see Islam having any more fights before that point where he would lose the belt. So I think Conor McGregor is looking at that, and he's probably licking his chops because he's like, Michael Chandler hasn't done much for the sport lately. Dan Hooker did something a couple weeks ago that was pretty awesome. It's pretty much an even fight, whether I fight Chandler or Hooker. It's going to be a close, tough fight both ways, but it's stylistically, I'll take either one of those. And since Chandler's just not as in the news as most people, or certainly not Dan Hooker, it makes more sense for him to go towards Hooker because I think there's a better shot and a better road towards the title.
Yeah, and I think it's a better matchup stylistically for Conor. Chandler is too unpredictable.
Yeah.
He's got, if he does want to break out the wrestling, he can do that. He's got those massive overhands.
Right.
You know, Hooker's really exciting, but I think the likelihood of Hooker finishing Conor is lower than Chandler.
Yeah.
But I put it at about 20%.
Okay.
That Dan Hooker jumps Chandler and fights Conor McGregor instead of Chandler.
Okay.
Where do you put that potential of that fight, of that actual scenario playing out where Michael Chandler gets sat to the side and they make McGregor versus Hooker?
Well, given the fact that Conor's been a notorious troll for a very long time, and now Hooker is really starting to insert himself as a troll, he's even admitting it himself, I think that they always like to do things that shock the crowd, that shock the UFC, that evoke emotions. And look, the comment sections on all of the posts, if that fight gets announced, are going to be crazy. A lot of negative stuff towards why didn't you give this to Chandler? Conor doesn't deserve a number 5 ranking, all that stuff. But that drives engagement. It's great for the algorithm. The UFC knows this stuff.
Yeah.
And if they can do that, Conor McGregor loves conflict. He loves fighting with these guys. And if he can fight with Michael Chandler by not even having to step in the octagon with him, but by screwing him out of a fight and giving it to somebody else, that's one way to have warfare with somebody. You don't actually have to go punch and kick them. You can go out there and mentally just tear them up. And nothing would feel worse for Michael Chandler than to go walk into the octagon and not have Conor McGregor in the ring or in the octagon waiting for him or coming out after. So I think Conor McGregor likes the idea. And for me, I'm going to go a little bit higher than you. I'd say it's about a 40% chance that Hooker steals it. And it's all because of the recency bias. I think people forget about Chandler because he hasn't been fighting all that long. And I think there's a little bit of a grudge between Hooker and Chandler because if I remember correctly,
Chandler welcomed Hooker to the
Hooker welcomed
Chandler to the UFC by knocking his ass out. So yeah.
Right. So who won the battle? Chandler. Yeah. But it looks like if Hooker can get this thing, he might win the war. And that's ultimately something that's a storyline the UFC would love to get a hold of. I think that all fighters involved, Hooker, Conor, and Chandler, would be pretty vocal about it. And you know Dan Hooker would rise to the occasion, promote the fight really well. And after his last performance, he's going to bring you fireworks. So Conor McGregor sees that kind of stuff. I think he understands from a business point of view, if I want to get to another title shot, I really do need to fight somebody in the top 5. And as far as the landscape of 155 goes, Dan Hooker sitting at number 5 is his best possible chance at winning against a ranked top 10 opponent and then finding himself in the title shot.
Yeah. Perfectly said. And I'm gonna say 20 because I think that I don't know what the UFC would do with Chandler otherwise. And you have to do so. I mean, people like Michael Chandler. They want to see him fight.
Right.
Hooker just fought, so it's we have Hooker out for 6 months, and then he comes back and fights another big up and coming prospect at 155. I think we'd all just accept that and enjoy it. But with Chandler, it's like what do you do with him otherwise? But I want to finish the conversation today on Sugar Sean O'Malley.
Oh yeah.
So he's come out and said, look, I'm a little bit displeased with the way the UFC is promoting my next fight.
Right.
And he believes that it's all based on the sphere, the venue.
Yeah.
Riyadh season, we've pulled the Saudis in. This is going to be the craziest spectacle from a visual standpoint. We got this massive screen behind us. The cage is going to be interactive. But hey, at the end of the day, I'm one of the best bantamweights ever. I'm going to be fighting a guy who's on a 9-fight win streak. There's a built-in storyline because I knocked out his friend and teammate to become the champion.
Right.
Where's the storytelling on, not just the Sphere, not just Mexican Independence Day, but Sean O'Malley, the champion, versus this really worthy contender? So it got me thinking, and I want to talk to you about, what are your thoughts on, the Sphere event as a whole? Is the UFC really putting too much emphasis and effort into the venue and making this like a 3-dimensional visual sound, almost like a 4D type experience?
Right.
I'm picturing people in the crowd with 4D glass. Those, you go to a theme park and some of the attractions have those
IMAX.
IMAX, whatever. But to me, it feels like they are somewhat missing the mark on the promotional side.
Yeah.
And because you put one of your biggest stars at the top of the bill.
Right.
You know, it always matters who's walking out last on a pay-per-view.
Right.
And, you know, aside from John Jones, Alex Pereira, Conor McGregor, Taporius making his way there.
But not yet.
But not, I mean, Sean O'Malley's one of the top 5 guys when his music hits the speakers and he walks out, big fight feel runs through the air. And I do kind of agree with Sean that, you know, yes, it's important. Yes, it's monumental. Yes, this venue is unlike any other venue in the world right now. I am dying to go to the Sphere. They're selling tickets for $3,500 for the cheapest tickets that you can find. I mean, it's going to be a massive event. But don't forget why we're here.
Right.
At the end of the day, the cage is going to lock, and 2 very skilled bantamweights are going to fight.
Yeah, and I love that Sean pushed back on this. And Sean's been a company man since he got to the UFC.
Yeah.
And he's never really ruffled feathers with the UFC brass, and for good reason. I don't think he's actually angry with the UFC. I think this is more of a promotional side.
Yep. He's like,
okay,
I'm going to do the promoting myself.
Exactly what I was going to say. He's like, okay, they're not going to promote it, then I'm going to cause a little drama because controversy is king. Anything that can come out and you get some sort of top draw versus the organization type of news, that will steal headlines. And Sugar Sean has been really good at staying relevant, staying in people's minds, staying in the news. Obviously, he's a pretty active fighter. He's climbed up the ranks and then got to his belt pretty quickly. And he's very well liked online. And if you remember on 299 when he fought Aljamain Sterling, he got that beautiful knockout, and then within seconds, it was on Instagram. It was on social media, which is something we've never seen. They always hide the knockouts. They always hide the pay-per-view fights, so you have to go pay for them. Sugar Sean's a little bit different. He's kind of a modern-era fighter where they understand a large bulk of his audience is online. They want to see this guy, but they don't want to buy the fight. Maybe they're not a full-blown UFC fan that's invested yet. They need to watch it real quick. Well, no better way than to give them a 20-second clip of him knocking out somebody and doing something really cool, speaking on the microphone, this, that, and the other thing. So I think Sugar Sean is taking a good approach at trying to promote this thing. And when you think about what he's saying, you have to understand he's not just talking, out of his backside. He's really making a good point, because when you watch the promotional stuff, last night they were showing it for the Cannonier fight. Half the promotion is B-roll of the outside of the arena, and then they'll show the B-roll of the inside. And of course, you'll see some highlight reels of Suga, and you'll see some great footage of Merab working. But Merab is doing a great job with his social media presence. He's got one of the newest, most fun pages you can watch.
It's original
in social media. He's not trying to be Suga. He's not trying to be Conor. He's making self-deprecating, funny videos, and people are really clinging to it. So you've got 2 great stars. And what I don't want them to do is what Sean's saying, pull away from this great fight with these great fighters just to talk about the venue. It kind of reminds me, and it's sort of parallel to what happened with UFC 300. Now, if you remember, they were gassing up this card like it was going to be the craziest thing of all time. We're like, who are they bringing back from the dead to fight for UFC 300?
Exactly, yeah.
Like, we don't really know which direction they're going to go. And then as soon as they did make the announcement, which it was a great fight, which was, the whole card was really awesome. It was a special night. But when they made the announcement, they didn't quite get the fights that they wanted, and they had to just present to us what they got. And it was still an amazing night of fights. Everybody really enjoyed it. But when you start to push something so heavy, you really do pigeonhole yourself into a corner, and you have to make this thing even more ridiculous than what people are anticipating. And the way Dana's talking is very similar to the way he was talking about UFC 300. He's like, you've never seen anything like this. You're never going to see anything like this again. It's a totally unique event, one of one. He's using that term again. And it feels like the same thing for 306. And part of me feels like maybe they're not learning their lesson. Like, yes, we want to see this fight take place. Yes, the Mexican Independence Day was a raging success for them last year, and it makes sense for them. There's a lot of great fighters coming out of Mexico right now. The PI is down there in Mexico City, so it makes sense for them to pay homage. But as I was thinking about it, and you read the comments and whatnot, they're like, oh, every fight needs to have a Mexican or 2 Mexicans on it. And for me, the UFC is a international business, and MMA is an international sport. And it would feel almost like they were slighting the Mexican fans if they were to only stack it with Mexicans. And
yeah,
not,
you can't have a main event with there's no Mexican fighter that would be worthy of a main event at the Sphere because you want to do it right. You know, if there was a great #1 contender that's, you know, from Mexico that's on his way up, that's a really exciting fighter, of course, yeah, put the champion in there against this guy and build. They don't normally build pay-per-view cards around the challenger of the main event, but that could be an exception. But yeah, there's really nobody, and I'll let you continue your point there, but there's really nobody that you could put at the top of the bill that's going to sell and draw as much as Sean and Merab. So you do kind of have to, you know, promote them a little bit more than the Independence Day tribute and the arena itself in my eyes.
Yeah, great point. And that's what I was thinking, because I was kind of the same mind whenever I was, you know, engaging on social media and looking at what people were saying, like, oh, there's not enough Mexicans. The main event needs to be a Mexican champion. It's like, well, we don't have a male Mexican champion right now. We need to.
We have Alexa in the co-main, which is the right spot.
It's a perfect amount, and that's a big fight. It's a trilogy and everything like that. But let's not veer off from what the UFC is. We give you the best fights possible. We're going to put them on in the most spectacular fashion possible. And since it's such an international sport, let's just put the best fight we possibly can on for these people and give them the best product possible rather than trying to cater to them. Let's obviously know that this is a worldwide sport, and these Mexican fans that watch the UFC, they love all these fighters, just like I love people from Russia. I love people from China. I love all these fighters from all over the world. I'm a big fan of. And I really do think that putting Sean and Merab was a good move, but I am kind of with Sean that they're pushing the venue a little bit too much. I think you just let that be sort of understated, and so people are blown away, and their anticipation doesn't kill their the reality. You know, they're expecting this insane spectacle, and then they get something really cool, but you know, the building didn't, you know, blast off into space during the fight. Elon Musk's help, and they're orbiting the Earth, and then, you know, that sort of stuff is what people start to expect when the UFC and Dana White start to talk a big game like this. So I think what they should do is obviously talk about the Sphere being such a unique event. It's the first fight event taking place in the Sphere, the Mexican independence. For sure, talk about all that stuff, but let's not forget why we're here. We're here to see the best fighters in the world compete against each other. And as far as bantamweight goes, it's been the most talented division, if not one of the top 3 most talented divisions since its inception in the UFC. And I think when you've got guys like Merab, who's probably as skilled as we've ever seen in the bantamweight division, and then Sugar Sean O'Malley, who, I'll say it time and time again, is the most skilled striker in the entire UFC, which means he's the best striker in the entire world as far as MMA goes. You're doing the right thing by putting these guys out there, regardless of where they come from or anything like that. So I think Merab and Sugar are doing a lot to promote this fight on their own. And if the UFC takes the direction they did with 300 and they go promote the venue and they promote everything aside from the X's and O's and the fighting, it might fall flat a little bit. But with Sugar Sean manning the ship and Merab Dualis really being a very good business partner and opponent for Sean to go with, I think we're still going to get a special night of fights, and I think this one will live up to expectations better than 300 did, but at the same time, I totally get where Sugar's coming from.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why I think they need to promote the fight a little bit more than the event and Mexican Independence Day more specifically. Okay. Because, you know, Dana has come out and said this fight night is going to be a love fest to Mexican culture. Yeah. Mexican culture is a fighting culture. It's, you know, ingrained in the people there. But you know what Mexicans also love? Boxing. Oh, yeah. You know who they really, really love? Canelo Alvarez. Oh, yeah. Do you happen to know when Canelo Alvarez's next fight is?
Something tells me it's the exact same night.
The exact same night. Do you happen to know where his next fight is?
It couldn't possibly be in Vegas, is it?
Right down the road at T-Mobile Arena. Oh. So, you know, the reality is there's not that Mexican superstar in MMA that matches Canelo Alvarez's level of stardom in boxing, not by a wide margin. Right. You know, if you were to poll 100 Mexican people at random who are fight fans and say, would you rather watch a UFC pay-per-view card with Alexa Grasso, or would you rather watch Canelo in a pay-per-view boxing marquee event? My guess is that about 99 of the 100 people are going to say they'd prefer to see Canelo Alvarez fight if you get Alexa's cousin in the random selection of 100 people, you might get one for Alexa.
Right.
Now, that's no slight to Alexa Grasso. Mexican MMA is still in its infancy, and boxing, the tradition there is long lived. You
Couldn't
know,
be richer.
hundreds of years, and so the reality of the situation is, you do kind of need Sean O'Malley, who's not Mexican, and Merab, who is also not, to cover this, you know, to do some heavy lifting.
Right.
Because the fans that turn up to watch this fight and the fans that press play on the pay-per-view, even if they're splitting screen with the boxing event and the UFC event,
Right.
those fans for MMA are going to be your worldwide MMA fans.
Right.
Because most of the Mexican fight fans are going to be watching Canelo Alvarez.
True.
And I think that, you know, Dana was not happy about it, and rightfully so, because they do a lot of business with T-Mobile, that they gave that venue to Alvarez on the same night of the fight, which is like, you know, Canelo almost always fights on Mexican Independence Weekend. So you kind of knew that Canelo was going to fight this night.
Right.
But does it have to be down the street? You know what I mean? Like, think of all the other places that fight could have taken place. And, you know, maybe do it on the West Coast so it's a couple hours or it's 1 hour behind.
Or go to Mexico City.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I think Nevada is actually, I'm going to correct myself. Nevada is on West Coast time, Pacific time. Do it in, you know, New York City. Do it somewhere, you know, maybe Miami, something like that, where it's a different time zone, and maybe you can actually slide the Canelo fight in right before or right after.
Right.
But to be competing in the same city, the same night, the same time, you know, I think it's going to detract a lot of the Mexican viewership because Canelo's such a big star, and that leaves Sean O'Malley to carry the heavyweight. So that for that reason and others and other reasons, the fact that Sean, this is a legacy fight, this is a big worthy opponent, undefeated opponent, very good stylistic matchup. I think the UFC should steer just a little bit more. I mean, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make a venue look cool.
Right.
Obviously promote that, but don't forget that you do have one of your biggest stars on the top of the bill, and make sure you promote him and this big fight just as much as you're promoting the venue itself.
Right, and I don't correct you that often, but usually you have the stats better than me, but you said he's fighting an undefeated fighter, and I'll just tell you that Merab Dvalishvili is undefeated in his last 10.
Yes.
But he did lose a couple, and I think he lost to Ricky Simon, who, if I'm not mistaken, is a Mexican-American fighter, so there's a little bit of synergy there. But no, I think you're absolutely right. There's so much head-to-head battling going on between Canelo's fight and the UFC. Same city, same time, same night, everything like that. So what you have to do is realize, okay, yes, there's going to be a lot of people from Mexico paying attention to Canelo's fight. How do we make this an international thing? We'll pay homage to Mexico. Everybody else will see that there's a tasteful amount of history being shown and respected and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the UFC is a worldwide sport that trumps boxing right now. It's not even close. You know, as far as growing a sport, MMA, and particularly the UFC, is eating boxing's lunch. So they have their one night every now and again, and yeah, they'll get close to business with you. They'll hit the same numbers as you, might even outshine a little bit. But every weekend, the UFC's coming with something hot, and I think sticking to your international plan, don't just cater to whatever venue you're going to or whatever holiday you're fighting on. Just keep giving the people the best fights you can possibly make, with the best fighters from wherever they happen to be coming from, and you'll get the best results possible. So at the end of the day, Suga and Merab are doing their part. I believe the UFC sees Sean as a good company guy, and he doesn't ruffle feathers. He's not a jerk to them. I'm sure he just expressed a little bit of personal irritation, and they're probably going to change that. I guarantee in the next couple of weeks or until that fight comes out, we're going to see a little bit more. Maybe they'll spruce up the embeddeds and they'll spruce up the countdowns a little bit extra, or they'll give Sean some extra press time or something like that. What they're going to do is not just avoid Sugar Sean's request and not just ignore him. They're going to listen to him. They're going to continue to push the sphere, but I think Sugar calling it out was a good thing, because all they're going to do from there is take his advice, listen to him, and make this card even bigger. But nothing helps that ball get rolling faster than Sugar Sean creating a fake controversy or a feud with the UFC. I think it was brilliant.
Well said. Well, guys, that's all for today's episode. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave us a comment and let us know, do you think Sugar Sean O'Malley's being overlooked because the Sphere is such a big venue and it's on such a big night, or do you think the UFC's balancing the promotion well? We'd love to hear from you, and we will see you next Monday. Until then, have a great weekend.
Check out the Discord. Peace.
Yes.